South Africa has changed. The old one is gone. It died on the 29th of May, 2024, as the whole country went to vote. As of this morning, Friday the 31st of May, three major projections from three very reputable sources, which is the ENCA projection, the CSIR projection, and the News 24 projection, all agreeing that the African National Congress is going to drop to 45% or below from 57% 5 years ago in 2019, an historic collapse. Millions and millions of voters turned their back on the ANC this time in a way that we've never seen before in this country with the ANC. But this percentage collapse is one of the biggest of any democracy ever for a dominant political party, particularly one that's been in power for 30 years. The ANC have dropped like a stone and been completely humiliated. We're going to talk about the massive difference between if they get 45 or 43 or 40. It's going to have a huge difference to where this country goes. This is the issue with the election that changed everything. And now you're probably thinking, where have the votes gone then? Surely they've gone to their main rivals, although I always struggle to call the DA and the EFF rivals of the ANC because they are so far behind the ANC in terms of votes. But their main rivals from 2019 and before, the second and third biggest parties, the DA and the EFF, you'd think that they would have picked up some of the ANC's tab, but they haven't at all, because all three projections now project that the DA will maybe grow like a couple of parts of a percent, a fraction of a percent. Sorry, it's been a long time since I did matric maths, but like a fraction of a percent. And remember, the DA likes to say that they can really challenge the ANC. They blamed their lackluster 2019 election results exclusively on Mmusi Maimane and like the kind of strategy that he embodied. They kicked him out, and now they have stayed where they are, barely grown at all. It's awkward for the Democratic Alliance and for the EFF, who've been telling us that they are leaders of this country in waiting, that they are on the way.
I'm going to be president of this country, whether you like it or not.
They look like they're going to stay the same, or more likely, go backwards. They're going to shrink for a movement that has described itself as an inevitable force. It is so embarrassing, and it shakes the foundations of the Julius Malema economic freedom fighter Red Beret mythology, which is we are this inevitable movement that is rising. They might get between like 11% or even down to 9%, back to single digits. It is crazy. And that's why the country is so different right now. It will never be the same again. We may never see the ANC have a 50% plus one vote majority ever again. We may not see any party ever get a 50% plus one majority again. And we are now in full-on coalition countries. Reminding you again, it is Friday, the 31st of May at like, what's the time now? 10:15. So there are still results to come out. So we're going to work with the ANC getting between 40 and 45%. We're going to work with the DA getting around 20-21%. And we're going to work with the EFF getting around 9 to 11%. A disaster for all of them. Well, maybe more, definitely more for the ANC. That's a humiliation. The EFF, it's bad. It's an embarrassment. And for the DA, it's awkward because they're stuck now. And how do you sell yourself as the future if you're stuck? But I think what's really interesting to consider is that this has been a roundhouse rejection of the three major parties in South Africa by voters. Fundamentally, the ANC has had a radical loss in support, but that hasn't gone to the EFF or the DA, which means that they have not presented themselves as good, compelling alternative options. And that's a really big deal. That means that voters want fundamental change, radical alternatives to what they've been offered. So what has happened? Where has the vote gone? To Jacob Zuma's MK Party, mostly. They are set to have a radical, almost record-breaking debut. Debuts are really hard. It's difficult to get a lot of people to vote for you. I remember Cope got like between 8 and 10% or something around that in their first time, and that was seen as huge. MK is tracking to get between 12 and 14%. That is radical and wild and fundamentally shifts the balance of power in South African politics. They're obviously trending towards 45, 46% in KwaZulu-Natal, which is massive. Before you think, oh, that means the MK is ruling there, current projection speculates that maybe if they're willing to do it, an ANC, DA, IFP tag team can get majority if they're willing to work together in KwaZulu-Natal. But we're going to get to potential, coalition outcomes in a second. So many interesting things have happened. MK to get 14%. They have levied off Jacob Zuma's popularity. The idea that he and his party have peddled that life was much better under Zuma's ANC and then all fall apart afterwards, to which many detractors respond, yes, but Zuma just made sure stuff was nice while he was there, and it was very clear that things were going to fall apart once he left because the structural pressure that his decisions and state capture were putting on South Africa's infrastructure, service delivery, government operations were always going to break, but he designed it in such a way that they break just after he was removed from power. But a lot of people, millions of people, particularly Zulu people, believe that Zuma is their guy, he is the one, and so they have voted for him in droves in KwaZulu-Natal. And the stipulations are crazy because he's taken votes from the ANC and the IFP, but the EFF has been shamboked, reduced to rubble in KwaZulu-Natal. The speculation is that they'll get below like 5% at the moment based on most projections, which is an absolute rout. Very bad for the EFF's prospects of growing as a party. The DA has done its best, but like not really grown significantly, despite being led by Chris Papas, who is seen as a kind of breakthrough candidate in that he is young and from rural areas and white but can speak Zulu and get the respect and the ear of many Zulu people. But KZN is a really big deal because KwaZulu-Natal's got the second most voters of any province in South Africa, and so it has really, really big ramifications. What else has happened elsewhere? The ANC has held on a couple of its strongholds, places like the Eastern Cape, but even in all dominant strongholds like in Mpumalanga, they have dropped significantly. And what else has happened? Where else have some of the ANC votes gone? But also, DA votes, maybe even EFF votes. It's the Patriotic Alliance. It's Gayton McKenzie. And Gayton McKenzie's party has generally been able to appeal to colored voters across the country and say, we are the change. We are able to fight crime. We are able to really take your issues seriously and cause change in your communities like nobody else has. But that's not the full story, because many people were speculating that the DA would really suffer in their stronghold, the Western Cape, but they haven't at all. They might drop like 1%, but they're still going to get a majority and going to get way bigger than the second or third biggest parties. At the moment, the speculation is the second biggest party might still be the ANC, but they've dropped by 9 points. They've gone to 20%. So if anything, the DA has strengthened their advantage over any rival party in the Western Cape. But the reason why people thought the DA might be in trouble was Palestine, Gaza, Israel, the kind of like very soft, gentle, kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, back rub kind of national politics or position that the DA has taken on Israel-Palestine.
It's not my or your role to determine genocide. We have international bodies that determine genocide. One side's genocide could be another side's freedom fighting.
But it didn't happen. There's a lot of speculation about why Muslim colored voters seem to have not left the DA in droves over this position. Some say, well, if your alternative as a colored person is the ANC and the ANC's been dreadful and that's why you went to the DA in the first place, or if your alternative as a colored person is the Patriotic Alliance who are militantly Zionist, then the DA might still be the best of a raft of not ideal options. But where does this leave us? If these projections stay on track, which it looks like they're going to, if the ANC gets between 40 and 45, and they are going to get somewhere between 40 and 45 nationally, they're going to need to go into coalition to rule. And that's hectic, because let's say they get 45. If they get 45%, then they only need 5% more to rule. And that is far better for them than to get 40% in a non-obvious way, which is that they can then partner with much smaller parties, get a collection of parties, maybe 4 of them that got a 2%, a 1%, a 1%, and a 1%, right? And they can buy off those parties by giving the party leaders like a ministerial position here, like they did with Patricia de Lille with the Good Party last election. And they can largely control the coalition to rule because they are overwhelmingly the dominant. But if the ANC gets 42 or 40, if they need to get 8 to 10%, then they're going to need to partner with some of their rivals, because they won't be able to make that outstanding 8% off of cobbling together a grand coalition with much smaller parties. Remember, every time you add a party to a coalition, it becomes way harder to manage. And if one of those parties fights or kicks up a fuss or throws a stroppy, then suddenly you don't have a majority anymore. So ideally, if you have to go into coalition, you get one partner or a couple of partners. But if the ANC wants to do that and they get 42 or 40% and they need to get 8 to 10%, they're going to have to work with one of their bigger rivals, which means DA, MK, and EFF. And that is fascinating, because MK, you would imagine, have to be off the table, right? Jacob Zuma has humiliated the ANC. He dragged them, called them the worst possible things, and has now created a party that has given them an historic humiliation at the polls. It seems incredibly unlikely that they'll work together. Also, his daughter, Duduzile Zuma, spoke just yesterday in an interview and said that they never work with the ANC. So probably not MK. Then there's the EFF. Now, the EFF and the ANC have worked together before in local government coalitions, but maybe the ANC is thinking to themselves, the EFF is genuinely a threat to our supporter base, because the EFF could maybe genuinely convince some of our voters to vote for them in future. We don't want to strengthen them too much. We don't want to say give Julius Malema the vice presidential position and create this coalition with the EFF, which may not even be enough, by the way. Remember, because if the EFF gets 9 and ANC gets 40, they're going to need a third, but the EFF can get them most of the way there. On the other hand, the EFF has gone backwards. Not as much as the ANC, even nearly, but if the EFF stays the same or goes backwards, which it looks like it's going to do, then they could be treated as a weak coalition partner. That's interesting. Maybe the ANC would prefer to do that. And then the last option is the Democratic Alliance. And in the last month or so, both John Steenhuisen and then yesterday Helen Zille have been batting their eyelashes publicly in interviews, saying they'd be happy to work with the ANC in a coalition to keep out in their eyes the greater evils, which is the EFF and Umkhonto we Sizwe. I don't know about that, because there'll be certain parts of the ANC who loathe the DA, and the DA said some filthy and awful things about the ANC, and it's been said right back to them over decades now. But other people in the ANC may think to themselves, DA voters are unlikely to ever be ANC voters, and ANC voters are unlikely to ever be DA voters. So if we're going to coalition with them, it may not be the worst thing, because we're unlikely to lose voters to the DA. On the other hand, voters of the ANC might go, how could you work with the DA? You've been against them the whole time. But then the last question that is quite interesting on this is who between the EFF and the DA are closer to the ANC's actual real politics? Because we know that the EFF has pulled the ANC in different directions, like land, for example, in the past. But we also know that in many ways, the DA and ANC have quite similar policies, but so do the ANC and the EFF. Neither is a perfect and comfortable match. So if you think of it from a policy perspective and the terms and conditions of the smaller parties, if they say, if we will go into coalition with you, it's quite interesting. And one last basic thing is you need to think about what would this other coalition party want? Because I think fundamentally the ANC doesn't want to give a rival party the vice presidency. They just don't. That would be so humiliating for them. And if it's much smaller parties, they can choose not to do that, because the smaller parties will take what they can get knowing they can be replaced. But if it's the EFF with 9%, maybe an incredibly legitimizing, powerful political position. And if it's the DA with 20 to 21%, then really maybe. And then the DA and the EFF would be able to spin these objectively bad results for them this election into good results. So that's where we are. It is Friday, the 31st of May at 10:26 a.m. We will be back early next week with the rest of the results and information and early talk about coalitions. That's definitely going to happen over the weekend. South Africa's wild. It's a movie. This is The Watch Party.